Okay, so the meeting is being recorded, and we're just going to get going here. So first of all, I just want to say thank you to Allie and Christina for organizing this event and the larger programming of Black History Month. It's always a real honor to be a part of this, especially given the historical context, the present context, of sort of what's going on. So I just want to say again, thank you. And I want to thank everybody for attending too, because it's also a commitment to Black History Month and Black history more general. And we're, we're trying to sort of expand our knowledge and our experiences. And we're also trying to create knowledge. So, so thank you for that. And then another point I want to make too, is that this has been billed as a discussion. So I will have things to talk about, and I have a few PowerPoint slides, and I have picked a couple things out from the documentary that we could sort of reflect on, but I would like as sort of much discussion as possible. So at any time, please, feel free to chime in, ask a question, or submit a comment. You can either do that just sort of orally or, or vocally, or, through the chat. And I think Allie's looking at the chat there for us, so that's really helpful. So again, so it's a discussion, and I have, things to talk about, but I'd like to hear what you all, what you all have to say. So can I assume that everybody here has watched the documentary?
Yes, I have.
Okay, good. So why don't we just do this? So let's just watch the trailer to this documentary just to sort of refresh ourselves, okay? So I'm gonna just go pull up the trailer, and we'll sit back and just sort of get back into what we probably watched last week.
Out of 4 human beings with their hands on bars, shackled, in the world are locked up here in the land of the free.
Khalif Browder was walking home from a party when he was stopped by police.
Then they said, we're going to take you to the precinct, and most likely we're going to let you go home. And then I never went home.
The 13th Amendment to the Constitution makes it unconstitutional for someone to be held as a slave. There are exceptions, including criminals.
The loophole was immediately exploited. What you got after that was a rapid transition to a mythology of Black criminality.
Some people got the real problem.
Animals, beasts that needed to be controlled.
You better believe it.
I'm only human.
It became virtually impossible for a politician to run and appear soft on crime.
The kinds of kids that are called super predators.
Millions of dollars will be allocated for prison and jail facilities.
3 strikes and you are out.
There was an enormous burden on the Black community, but it also violated a sense of core fairness.
Some people got the real problem.
States were required to keep these prisons filled, even if nobody was committing a crime.
It's so difficult to talk about mass incarceration because it has become heavily monetized.
I'm only human.
The focus is on taking people from prison, putting them in community corrections, parole and probation.
How much progress is it really if now there's a private company making money off the GPS monitor?
We now have more African Americans under criminal supervision than all the slaves back in the 1850s.
I'm only human.
We are the products of the history that our ancestors chose. Products of that set of choices that we have to understand in order to escape from it.
We should go looking somewhere high.
Okay, so let me go back to my PowerPoint here, and I also want to, I guess, sort of continue with the introduction that I'm not an expert, and I can't speak with authority on mass incarceration. I'm not a legal expert, but I would like to share with you that I can speak with historical clarity on what themes that are being covered in this documentary that have everything to do with the development of racial and plantation slavery in the Atlantic world, racial slavery in British American colonies, racial slavery through the American Revolution up to the Civil War, and of course the passing of the 13th Amendment as part of the the Reconstruction Amendments, particular historical clarity through Jim Crow, beginning largely with the failure of Reconstruction in 1877 and then institutionalized in the racist policy of 1897 Plessy versus Ferguson, which includes disfranchisement, a separate but equal disfranchisement, segregation, and violence and lynching. Through World War II, the Civil Rights Movement and Black Power and Arts Movement into 1970s, as we understand the modern movement of mass incarceration, linking criminality and drugs in Black and Brown communities, the war on drugs proper in the 1980s, and the 1990s ideas of super predators. Okay, so these are all sort of things that I'm with. Okay, so the first thing I want to ask, because this is a conversation or a discussion, did anybody get a chance to look at that viewing guide that I had circulated actually, this is not a question from that. I'm remiss. So let me open up the question. Let me open up the floor to everybody. Elliot, Dr. Gutierrez, Lorena, Elizabeth. What are you viewing here, or what are you learning? And what are the principal ideas or theses in this documentary? That's my sort of parting shot for this discussion. What are we viewing?
Well, I think what I took from it, you know, when I first watched it a couple years ago, was that that, you know, there was slavery, there was Jim Crow, and that those same institutions, the same ideas that drove them, are reinterpreted and implemented through different institutions as we go throughout history. And that's what the modern, you know, prison system is basically doing, reinventing slavery, reinventing Jim Crow with another name. Okay, good. So I think what Allie is drawing on is we are viewing the current phenomena of mass incarceration through the only proper way that it should be viewed is through a historical perspective. So you could see the sort of cause and effects of different policies, of different sort of a rhetoric and imagery around the depiction of Black people and so forth. So I'm going to say that's one thing that we're learning. I think that's a very important thing. Anybody else? What are we viewing, or what are we learning through this documentary?
I think it helps us to understand how the system works. I mean, right now, more people are becoming aware of systemic racism, and we're struggling to understand how to dismantle it, let alone see it. And, you know, if we're taking down the statues and we're pulling down the flags, and those are easier, but now, how do we dismantle, how do we actually heal people of the trauma? How do we stop the trauma? How do we give support for people and not criminalize them and nurture them as human beings and all, you know, have the same opportunities? People feel really disempowered in our country at times. You know, we don't understand our political system. We don't have necessarily faith in our political system. What can we do? And what's the first step when we're so overwhelmed with our daily lives? So I feel like this was helpful to draw all of the, how, you know, how profit is related with prisons, is related with people, is related with drugs, is related with lack of services, you know, and that being an intentional thing. And I've been struggling the last year to figure out what I can do. And I think Cuesta is in a really unique position because we have a prison here, like minutes away from our school, and we can teach there. And we also have restorative partners in our community with people that are coming out of prison who need help who need a bridge back into the community. And I think there's a lot we can do, you know, just as citizens in our our system. And so I'm interested in like hearing your more of your thoughts and ideas. I started watching the film tonight after work, and I wasn't able to watch the very end. So not to give a spoiler for those tuning in, but I'm hoping maybe could someone fill me in just so that I'm better informed for this discussion?
I can, and let me do this. This is a great point that you brought this up. So, so first of all, I want to draw your own sort of observation to Ali's idea of systemic racism and tracing that through different institutions. And the documentary does a very good job at showing the relation between institutions and sort of political economy in that creates a sort of system. So we're getting all sorts of, again, sort of clear connections that I'll continue to make through the lecture or the conversation, excuse me. And I think something that you're bringing up is very smart too, Elizabeth. It's we're using this knowledge to do something, right? To act. And that's a very sort of, you know, a big cognitive step on why the history is important, because we're not consuming history and knowledge for the sake of consuming history and knowledge or in a passive sense. We're doing it in a very deliberate way. And I would also say that the documentary was made in a very sort of deliberate way to inspire action. So that's good. And what I've learned in a lot of different formats is, and this is a sort of simple answer, because we all live very, very busy lives. We're all parents and have jobs. And so a mentor that told me one time is you do what you can when you can. Sometimes you could go on a hunger strike for 10 days, or you could go lobby politicians, and sometimes you can't. Sometimes you could come to a discussion, and that's it. That's all you could do. So you do what you can when you can, okay? So we're viewing and learning all this about mass incarceration and its historic origins, and we're linking today's mass incarceration, right, with the development of racism and racist stereotypes in the United States, especially after the Civil War and after the passage of the 13th Amendment. So we don't have to answer this question. What I do want to do, because we're already spelling this out, is I thought one of the most powerful clips in parts of the documentary is this one. It's the very last part, Elizabeth, that you didn't get.
2 million people behind bars today.
People say all the time, well, I don't understand how people could have tolerated slavery. How could they have made peace with that? How could people have gone to a lynching and participated in that? How did people make sense of this segregation, this white and colored only drinking? That's so crazy. If I was living at that time, I would have never tolerated anything like that. And the truth is, we are living at this time, and we are tolerating it.
Mm-hmm. So that is the part. That's the conclusion. That's literally the final word of the documentary, that we are tolerating an incredibly sort of visceral injustice, right? That is, that's rooted in it's rooted in racism. It's rooted in a lot of things. So we have to sort of think about our own relationship to the issue and how we are tolerating it by not acting, or by not recognizing, or by not sort of understanding the sort of larger context, the sort of the historical roots and so forth. So I want to just bring you to your attention to who that man was. That man's name is Bryan Stevenson. Okay, and I first heard or learned about Bryan Stevenson when I was at Hampton University as a faculty member there. He is the founder and executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative. link to this. You could Google the Equal Justice Initiative, but he has dedicated his life largely to helping poor and Black and brown people through the criminal justice system. He is a Harvard-educated lawyer. He has a fantastical sort of personal story. All that said, I want you to also bring to your attention that Bryan Stevenson, through the Equal Justice Initiative, created the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. And if you're not familiar with this, this is the only memorial in the United States that honors the victims memorializes the victims of lynching, okay, which were somewhere in the neighborhood of 4,000 between the end of the Civil War to 1940. And what I said earlier, okay, the way the 13th Amendment made slavery illegal, right? The Reconstruction amendments also made Black people citizens. So after the Civil War, at least in theory, Black people were politically equal to white Americans. But that didn't work for the ontological order or sort of white people, because how can that be? So there was a vested interest in the three things to undermine the freedom and citizenship of Black people, and that was disfranchisement, and that was seen by all sorts of poll taxes, grandfather clause, and to undo the political gains made by African Americans during Reconstruction. The second was segregation, and we have to understand segregation. What segregation means is this, right? You hear it. Segregation is a maintenance of white supremacy. It means that, okay, Black people and white people, at least in theory, are equal under the law, but Black people aren't equal to socialize with white people, right? Whether in restaurants or swimming pools or little leagues and so forth. So there's segregation, okay, as a maintenance of white supremacy. And then the third part of that, Jim Crow violence, is that of lynching, okay? So lynching is a public spectacle and extra legal, and where, of course, you know, the white people have never been held accountable for the lynching of Black people. All that said, the relation here, Bryan Stevenson, the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, he's all through this documentary. He's one of the chief sort of intellectuals, Black or white, in the United States. He's an attorney. He founded the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, and he has this wonderful TED Talk came out in 2012 that talks about this, that I used to show to my students at Hampton University. And he wrote a book called Just Mercy. I haven't read the whole book. I think I read maybe the introduction and chapter, but that book has been turned into a film called Just Mercy. And you can hyperlink to this once Ali, or we'll circulate. You could write this down and probably just Google it. We'll circulate that. So I want to bring the end of the movie, or the conclusion, back to what you're saying, Elizabeth, is he's making, you know, we always say, oh, how could people have tolerated slavery? How could people have tolerated segregation? We are tolerating mass incarceration right now. So we have to recognize that first, and then create the actions to undo that. And Ali, I see there's some chats going. Does somebody want to raise a question or follow up? Or
sorry to be distracting. That's just me putting some links to some of the things that you're saying.
Okay, good. So I will actually, I'll zip it. And does anybody have any questions or comments about that?
I'm taking, I'm in graduate school right now for counseling, but we are working on multicultural counseling. And one of the TED Talks I was listening to, she was talking about dehumanization, and it, you know, I've always, you know, there's always that joke about, like, oh, calling Black people monkeys, and what is that? What does that entail? And really what it is dehumanizing the person, so that makes it just a little more easier to be racist to them, or just to, you know. And I think about that when it comes to these, I mean, we don't call them camps, but essentially they're camps, and that's where a lot of Latinx people are being held in right now. And I think about, by keeping that arm's length distance, you're kind of allowing it to happen because it's not really happening to you. And you think about, oh, well, you know, you try to rationalize with it. And I think that's what the whole purpose of what I was listening to is that it's just a little easier by making them say like, oh, well, they're not US citizens, or, you know, oh, they came over here illegally. Just by doing those little things gets people just a little more comfortable to get away with a little more, and it just continues on. And we're at where we are now. So I felt like this movie was really great. And I'll put that TED Talk in the chat if anybody wants it.
Yeah, Christina, I think that's very sort of very wise, observations that you're making. And I think the documentary says that specifically to the degree that the opposite of incarceration is humanization or humanizing, right? Because there is a dehumanization of Black males, particularly that is absolutely centuries old. And I have, as we go through the idea or the role of rhetoric and imagery, and that contributes to that dehumanizing, to make some past present connections. So I think that's very smart what you're saying, and what they said in the film about dehumanization, or humanization is the opposite of incarceration. And I'll go ahead and just take this a little bit further here too, Christina. You know, I did a whole dissertation on the memory of a concentration camp, how people remembered a concentration camp. And I'll tell you what, I would hold from a scholarly perspective who studied this, the language that you could apply to the conditions of people on the southern border are absolutely concentration camps, because they're people being held in mass confined against their will in inhumane conditions. So I think it's important too to call things what they are. And I don't think that, I don't want to go too far in the weeds about concentration camps and the monopoly on that term, but I think it's a fine recognition of that, because of the dehumanizing effect it has on people. So thank you, Christina. Does anybody else have any questions?
I don't have a question. I have a comment.
Go ahead, Krista.
I am in early childhood education, and I see this from a child's perspective, which of course encompasses the whole family unit. And if you come at it from a child's perspective, you will see things that you will not see from an adult perspective. And all children are considered equals. Like, all children deserve the right, and adults too. But if you get down to it, it is the family unit that we need to think about when it comes to racial situations. Like, I feel for all the children, and they are our future. And we can talk left and right about the adults, but when it comes down to it, it's about the children, and it's about affecting their future. And it's letting them know. And so we can talk as adults all day long, but if we're not bringing it down to a child's level and helping those children that are in these racial groups, then our adult conversation means nothing. And that's all I want to say at this point.
Let me follow up on that, because I think you're absolutely right. And I also recognize, and we recognize too, that the Black and brown children are less likely to have the same experience in their early childhood education because of their class. So we have to sort of see that. So it's sort of unequal from the beginning, right? You know, so when people talk about when people talk about sort of equity and they said, you know, we would give everybody like how do I was listening. Let me try to explain this in a second. Hold on. If you have one glass over here that is sort of say half full, and the other glass over here is a quarter full, and you put the same amount of resources or the same amount of water in each of those glasses, right? They're still going to be unequal. So you have to put more resources in the glass that's less full. And that's something that we have to you know, sort of recognize to cure the sort of institutional inequity that's built into not only our education system, but it's built into the economic systems, right, that are supporting the taxes, right, home ownership that supports local schools and so forth. Okay, so I think that's a very sort of smart point. So let me just go ahead and go to here. So actually, I had opened up. There was a fellow faculty member who watched the documentary, couldn't come to tonight's discussion, and I asked the faculty member if they wanted to present any questions. And this is the email. It says, well, what I've been thinking about since I saw the film is how something I read recently in How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. In the book, he says that he thinks policies are racist, not people. I'm paraphrasing, of course. He believes that racial problems come from policies and not people. The evidence in the film supports this idea, and I really like this idea. But I think maybe that policies are made by people, then doesn't it follow that individual white supremacists are the root of the problem? Maybe the whole thing is a chicken and egg paradox, and it doesn't even matter too, because we need better policies for sure. So I guess the question I'm posing to y'all is, where do you see this as an institutional issue, right, of racist policies, or do you see it on an individual, or is it both? So I thought this was a good question. I'd like to just open it up to get your thoughts on it, and then I could share what my thoughts are too.
Shall I go first? Or does somebody else want to?
Go ahead.
Okay, I'm not sure that I fully followed it, but like I said before, I think it gears around children. And if you can focus on the next generation and the next, the future, really, I think that a lot of questions get answered. If you go into science and neuroscience and you get into early childhood experiences, and if you really learn that the future really can be determined and can be focused on the first 7 years of a child's life, then you can change a generation. And so I feel like the missing link is with the children. Mm-hmm. You change children's perspectives and you will change generations to come. Children need more finances and they need more resources, families, and I feel like that is where the change will be made. But that may not be answering the question. I'm a little bit, it's been a long day.
You're right. Oh, we're all on the same day. It's all been long. Does anybody else want to follow up before I go?
I have something real quick. Oh, Elliot, go ahead.
Oh, thank you.
Done.
I think one of the things about the idea that it's the policies, mm-hmm. that's been kind of like perceptually a big leap for me, is to realize that the system's working the way it's meant to. It's really easy, as far away as I am from mass incarceration, to think that all the bad outcomes are accidental or the system going wrong. But when I've read more about, Reconstruction and Jim Crow and the stories of Black people in America, and it's really like more and more obvious that this system is meant to lock people up and to keep people separate. And so it's the idea that the policies are at fault. This really makes a lot of sense to me. I guess that's all I have.
And I think that's really smart. Allie, did you want to follow up on that, or did Dawn say, somebody say Dawn wanted to speak up?
Yeah, if Dawn wants to go ahead, Dawn.
Go ahead, Dawn.
Ooh, I think it's literally a problem of both, but there's really not much that you gain from identifying it as a problem of an individual, because obviously an individual creates a policy, but it's voted on by a group, usually. It's not a dictatorship. This is a democracy. It's communities are made of individuals. And so if one individual has a problem, the whole community has a problem.
Yeah.
And so I think that way, when we focus on seeing that it's the policy and not just one person down the street saying something or doing something, you actually address more of the problem. And then obviously you can get to the root of the problem and see this person has continuously created policies like this, so they are also a problem. But the fact that other people are enforcing the same policy is also, I think, a bigger issue.
I think that's really wise, Dawn. And I also think that, again, the enforcement is huge. What Elliot said too was really smart, that this is, people made the decision because this is how the sort of system is supposed to work. It's working, right? Mass incarceration. I have a very clear example of that. And we also have to think too, there's two things I want to make a point. I think the premise here is that policies are racist. However, racist policies don't exist in a vacuum by themselves. There's everything around that, right? There's the sort of cultural mores. There's racial jokes. There are, Jim Crow monuments, right? It's you can't just have what Christina was saying earlier, right? You have policies, right? But they're operating in lockstep with everything else. Okay. So that, and then the other thing I want to say too is, listen, and I think this was sort of the point, the follow-up point to that is, racism exists independent of policy, right? In other aspects. So there are institutions, policies in fact are racist, but racism can exist outside of policy and policies in institutions. And then so I guess the example here that was really striking to me in the documentary was ALEC, right? The American Legislative Exchange Council. And this talked about the marriage between corporations and politicians, where corporations influence through lobbyists, right, legislation, and in fact write the legislation that the lawmakers will introduce and legislate, right? So it also brings to the attention, right, Alex, the relationship with Walmart, with the corrections corporations of America and so forth. So let me just go ahead to that part of the clip and just sort of see how this, I think, to Elliot and everybody's point, how the people behind, right, the policies are doing exactly what's meant.
After the outcry over Stand Your Ground and the Trayvon Martin tragedy,
Stand Your Ground was a legislative policy that was authored by ALEC, that was adopted in Florida, that got the killer of Trayvon Martin off because he stood his ground under this law.
Walmart stepped out of ALEC. It left ALEC, abandoned ALEC, but the Walmart family continues to fund ALEC. Other corporations followed suit and stepped away from ALEC, but many corporations are still members, including Koch Industries, State Farm Insurance, Pharma, which is the lobbying group for the pharmaceutical industry. ALEC has been supported by the tobacco industry, as well as AT&T and Verizon. And for nearly 2 decades, one of those corporations was Corrections Corporation of America.
Every day we serve our communities, from small towns to large cities at more than 60 locations across our country. As the nation's 5th largest correctional system, we build, own, and manage secure correctional facilities.
CCA was the first private prison corporation in the U.S.
Write that down. The first private prison corporation in the United States. Right? And this is where we get the idea of the prison industrial complex. And Brian Stevenson will explain here shortly how that all runs down.
There's a small company in Tennessee in 1983.
These folks started making contracts with states, and they had to protect their investment, so the states were required to keep these prisons filled, even if nobody was committing a crime. And in the late 80s and early 90s, this became a growth industry, unlike very few growth industries in America.
This parallels, of course, Ronald Reagan's war on drugs, okay, which parallels a lot of other things, but it's lockstep.
It's history. It was absolutely a model guaranteed to succeed.
And one of the ways we see that is through the role of CCA within ALEC to advance a series of bills.
All the legislation you could think of that we fight so hard against, 3 strikes, you're out.
3 strikes and you are out.
Mandatory minimum sentencing laws.
Serve at least 85% of their sentence.
We're the ones that were putting out there, like on a premier prefix dinner menu, a steady influx of bodies to generate the profit that would go to the shareholders.
Through ALEC, CCA became the leader in private prisons. It's a multi-billion-dollar business today that gets rich off punishment.
There you go. Okay, so that is sort of that in practice. Okay, so let me see if I could try to stay on track here. This is the 4th conversation I've had that I went through a lot of stuff today. So what I want is, I guess my next slide is, I put the 1860s racist policy, right? If we're, ALEC operated in the 1980s, right? We need to think about past-present connections and how these policies, they're historical precedent. They're not coming out of anywhere. And what comes to my mind, of course, are something known as black codes. Okay, and black codes were adopted in response to the 13th Amendment. You remember, this is the whole documentary is the 13th Amendment, but it was the black codes were adopted by the former Confederate states who've been brought back into the Union, and their laws that apply only to black people. Okay, so this is something that you need to think about, that the institution of slavery in the antebellum era was at the center of Southern legal, political, economic, cultural, and social life. Okay, so when that is challenged with the 13th Amendment, black people need to not be equal to white people. So there's an application of this, and you're reading, I think this is from a museum, but the idea here is that there's this very strict restriction on freed men, where, for example, freed men or former enslaved need to have a labor contract. If they don't have a labor contract, guess what? Then they could be arrested for vagrancy. And then when they're arrested for vagrancy, then they could be rented out as laborers. And these are these chain gangs that you see through the American South through the early half of the 20th century. A lot of the ditches, the freeways, the highways, the roadways, it was largely, I don't want to say free labor, it was largely labor done by black inmates who had went through a racist sort of criminal justice system. So the black codes are restricting black people, again, from quote unquote loitering, vagrancy. They can't use alcohol, they can't possess firearms, they can't hunt, they can't fish, they can't graze their livestock. Because here it is. the post-Civil War era for the South, first of all, the South are mad as hell. They've lost the war. They've lost their property. However, 4 million former enslaved people are coming out of bondage. They don't have the skill. They don't have literacy. They don't have money. It's not like they're just getting up and going and like living. No. So it's a negotiation between white plantation owners controlling the labor of black people and black people negotiating their newfound freedom. So this is when we get the sort of idea of sharecropping and tenant farming on top of the black codes and on top of the disfranchisement, the segregation, and lynching or violence. So this is just a sort of connection I made, sort of past present, that shows the historic or this mythology of black criminality, okay, based on a desire to control the body and labors of freedmen, which was the soup du jour of it, as it were, of slavery, controlling the bodies and labor of black people. All right. So that, and then I think the past present connections I'm making today, yeah, again, when we're thinking about the mythology of black criminality from a historical perspective, and then the sort of the larger context. Oh yeah, this is it. So here, I want to. Yeah, this is it. Wait. Here. This is what I'm trying to draw is another example of black criminality and policies that are different for black people and white people. And this is it. This is it.
1980s, we were already starting to embark on a war on drugs, and then all of a sudden along comes this new drug, crack cocaine.
Steve Young reports on a new kind of cocaine called crack.
It's dangerous, it's deadly, it will kill you.
The drug epidemic is as dangerous as any terrorist that we face. That is just some of what was said today to House and Senate committees holding hearings on drug abuse in America.
We had this drug that could be marketed in very small doses, relatively inexpensively. This was going to just take over communities, and particularly African-American communities.
Crack was largely an inner city issue, and cocaine was largely a suburban issue.
Smokable cocaine, otherwise known as crack. It is an uncontrolled fire.
Congress, in virtually record time, established mandatory sentencing penalties for crack that were far harsher than those for powder cocaine.
The same amount of time in prison for 1 ounce of crack cocaine that you get for 100 ounces of powder cocaine.
Police here are cracking down.
Listen to that. The same sentence for 1 ounce of crack cocaine and 100 ounces of powder cocaine. It's a different application, right, towards black and white people.
On crack dealers.
Usually black or Hispanic, Latino, they were getting long sentences for possession of crack.
You're black with crack cocaine, you're going to prison for basically the rest of your life. And if you're white, you're pretty much getting a slap on the wrist.
Cocaine.
So that is, again, just a sort of illustration of the sort of racist policies and different application of law based on race, starting with ALEC in their relationship with the CCA, going back to the black codes, and then bringing back to the war on drugs and the difference between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. Right. So sorry, I got a little disjointed there, but does anybody have any comments or questions about that or connections that they see?
I know that Xavier had a comment. He let me know in the chat, so he can go ahead if you'd like.
Go ahead, Xavier.
Hey, good evening, everyone. Okay, so I think when thinking about policy and everything that we've been talking about so far,
the United States suffers from a pattern of American reactionary politics that basically, if you look at it, can predict catastrophe and the unequitable slippery slopes that we continue to find ourselves on. And in no less or better words, it's basically just white backlash. Every time that something happens that progressively moves the equity forward, we're constantly being brought backwards. Started with Reconstruction. The people in the South wanted a second real Reconstruction that didn't limit their income, like they mentioned in the documentary. And so when you basically think about going up to the Civil Rights Acts of 1964, and then another white backlash after that, and then it just constantly keeps happening over and over again. And it feels like progressively we cannot move forward because it just keeps happening over and over again. So when you think about the events of the last 4 years and the previous president and administration, you feel like all these issues have been escalated. They've created a sense of comfort among those that are involved in the backlash. And you really have this whole frame of policy that is backed by politicians. And so, but then you think that's on a larger scale and it's harder to affect. But realistically, I think about policy and being the smaller things that could happen. Like here on campus, we had a heavily contested resolution within our board that ultimately led to the events surrounded by Mr. Sizek. And, you know, there was even backlash there that was made very apparent in person, and the people that called in his support, that basically is veiled behind free speech and First Amendment. So ultimately, I feel like what I'm getting at is, as a society, earlier I mentioned that we need to find a way to heal and find a way to educate. But at the same time, it's almost like we're being held back by this force that just constantly keeps presenting itself and makes it really hard. And so documentaries like the one that we're talking about today really help educate, really help bring these issues to light. It's just, I feel like the people that want to hear the information look for it, and those that don't want to hear the information find people with like-minded ideas, and then they just kind of congregate together, creating these like uncrackable forces.
And, you know, I think it's very smart what you're saying. And you said that a million ways better, or times better than I could have said it. What comes to mind is this idea of this sort of grievance policies or grievance politics, right? Where white people are sort of the victims or what have you. So you have to create policies to protect the quote unquote way of life. And the other thing that reminds me of what you just said here too, it reminds me of James Baldwin. When he famously said, you know, something to the effect that, you know, white people, they don't want to know what's going on on the other side of the fence. And that's a real issue, because I think that you said, Ava, the people who want to engage and see what's going on, right? The information is there, but you have a large, you know, portion of the population, right, who are aggrieved, who have no desire to sort of see what's going on, quote unquote, on the other side of the fence, or in Black communities or Black institutions or what have you. Elizabeth, you wanted to say something?
Thank you. I wanted to share some ideas for things we can do. I've worked in like political organizing, and I think something that not everyone knows about is that our representatives in Congress are getting letters, emails, they're having lobbyists visit them, and that is supposed to be what determines how they vote on bills. And so you count as 450 people if you're a member of a lobbyist group. And so the issues that are important to us, we can look for lobbyists for those issues, for example, equity or you know, social supports. And we can, it's only the minimum to give to become a member is only $20. And then whenever they meet with the representative of your district, they represent you as the maximum number of people. So if you handwrite a letter, it's only 200. If you send an email, it's maybe 5 people that they estimate felt the same way, but didn't take the time to contact them. I mean, we all know about voting, and that's also really critical. I mean, just look at what happened in Georgia. Like, we haven't had this kind of Democratic majority for a really long time, to have one party in all three as a majority. So having those kind of opportunities can help the political process run more in the direction of equity. Also, on a more local level, I teach at the California Men's Colony, and I'm hoping that more teachers will want to teach there. I initially didn't know what to expect, and the videos they show you when you're being trained are very graphic and a little dissuading. But when you get inside and you meet the people, and I mean all the people, I'm talking about all the people that work there, I'm talking about the people that are incarcerated there, and we're all just people, and they're the same people in there as that are out here. And so I want, when they have a transcript from the classes they take in prison, they don't show the prison anywhere on the transcript, and they can leave us with a lot of certifications that helps them get out quicker. And so that's the one way we can help, is having more people in CMC providing education and supporting that. And then also Restorative Partners is an organization that is in San Luis Obispo, and they're essentially operate as the bridge between formerly incarcerated people and being, able to be self-actualize and live the life that they want to live outside of prison. And they do really amazing work. We work with them. So Restorative Partners is interested in having their clients as Cuesta students. And we have the culinary program in a partnership with Restorative Partners. So they just basically have them in our classes. And so, yeah, I just wanted to make that clear. I really feel like if we take advantage of the powers that we do have, we can make a big difference. So thanks to everyone who is taking the initiative.
I think Andrea, she had a comment as well. Maybe.
Does anybody else, while we wait for Andrea to?
I just have one thing. So the chance, this is Anthony, sorry, I'm still in the parking lot waiting for my daughter. So my video is not gonna work right now. But the Chancellor's Office for the California Community Colleges just had a webinar in regards to incarceration. So they had formerly incarcerated as well as currently incarcerated individuals who were sharing their stories. So I will see if the transcript's available, because it was really powerful to hear their stories. And I think Elizabeth, you were on that one too, right? Did you listen to that one? So yeah. So it was pretty powerful to hear the stories from those individuals. And so if I can, I'll check with the Chancellor's website to see, and I can always forward it to Allie so she can forward it to this group. So that way you can listen in on, and these are current students that are working with us right now. And one more thing, sorry, or I'll just say one more thing, and that was it. When you were talking, Zach, earlier, it brought back memories of, because I grew up here in the Alley area, and always with Pete Wilson and Three Strikes, and it was always about fear. It was always about, people that look like me or look like my friends, and so it was always frustrating. And especially with the Three Strikes, and then with Reagan in the 80s, and you got Pete Wilson, and 187. So it's just like a whole slew of things, and it's what Xavier said. It goes back centuries, and then every year, every time we have something where I feel like you go back, you try to take a few steps forward, And now with social media, it feels like that pulls us back because you have all the disinformation that's shared, you know, all over the place in terms of that. So anyways, I just wanted to share that before other people go. Thank you.
I just was going to say that I don't think my biases about people in prisons would have changed without Cuesta having the partnership with CMC. And I think it goes back to the idea of dehumanization, or, you know, I can only imagine what would change if those camps were to close down and those people would come into the community, you know, because we deal with, we have an undocumented student population on campus. And some of those families, some of those students live in fear attending, and they easily could have been one of those, you know, those students in the situation waiting that there will be some change, that they could be released. And so I just think about the moment that they start to engage with others in the community, those biases change. And yeah, I really do feel like that really did help me by getting to know some of our CMC students.
Can I say something? So, oh. I just really felt like, by what you just said, like that was amazing. I didn't know that we worked with CMC at all. And I feel like more people need to know that. That's major. I want to work with CMC. Like, that's where my heart is. Like, I'm all about the family unit, and there's families that go through CMC together with whoever is in CMC. And I feel like it's such a close contact, and obviously, like, it's right there across the highway. And that's where my heart is. And I didn't even know that until you just said it. And I would love to get more involved in that interaction between Cuesta and CMC. I think that's amazing. And I think more people need to talk about it, and more people need to know about it. And I feel like that is our greatest asset and strength right there. When you talk about it, we have such a beautiful connection to a prison locally and across the highway. And I think if more people knew, then more people would want to get involved. So thank you for sharing that. And
yeah,
I
that's
was
a really nice thread that Anthony and Christina and Elizabeth and Krista just sort of wove together for us. That was really, really good. And I'd like to pick up on something. We are past the hour, and I'm going to go ahead and think about the sort of, you know, this idea of imagery and rhetoric. And Anthony talked about fear, and I think that Xavier did too. And there's this idea here that I've picked up, that the sort of fear is operating on two levels. And if you'll remember in the documentary, something that really, really surprised me was I don't know what percent, but it was a large majority of the percent of young Black men who are incarcerated never go to trial. They accept a plea bargain, right? Because they're afraid. Because the DA, right, will say, if you go to trial, then you're really gonna get it, right? You're gonna be behind bars forever, right? So you have young Black men who are poorly represented in counsel, and who are afraid of getting the book slammed at them. Then they accept these plea bargains, right? And will admit to a crime that they didn't commit. So there's fear on that. There's the fear on that level that is part of this conversation, and there's fear on the other level that goes back to our original, or the beginning of our conversation about racism and policies and culture. And there was the case of Willie Horton, if you remember, and how he was represented in, going to everybody's point here, I think especially Christina's, as dehumanization of a person. He was a murderer. He was a rapist, and of course he was black. And this largely sunk Dukakis and put George Bush on the path to the presidency. The first George Bush. And because he took the mantle of this sort of the law and order. So I'm thinking about, from a historical perspective, of course, right, how the images of Black people have been represented historically and by whom. And that's really, really important about who the authors are. And I'm going to pull up a comparative historic example of imagery. And of course, the documentary started out with the imagery coming out of Birth of a Nation, the feature-length film that was started in 1915 that showed Black men as a threat to white women in white purity. So this goes like this. First of all, I want to give you if you are not familiar with this painting. This painting is it's called The Banjo Lesson. It was painted by Henry Osawa Tanner in 1893, one of the premier American artists who happened to be Black in the 19th and 20th century. And he is painting an image, right, of Black men, boys, right, to counter the issues of racism that he and Black people are experiencing in the 1890s. Again, this is, you know, the onset of Jim Crow. This is the failure of Reconstruction. This is it. And the Banjo Lesson, right, is the thematic here is to show the connections to Africa through the instrument of the banjo, and then also, of course, the importance of the institution of family and the passing of knowledge from generation to generation. So this is a very famous painting, and it's a depiction of Black people that's meant to counter these very stereotypical racial depictions of African Americans that are circulating at the same time. So this is a series that was created by Courier and Ives. It was a large printing press that circulated in the 1890s called the Darktown comics. And they were meant to, again, dehumanize Black people, to suggest that they weren't able to participate civilly or civically in elected politics, and all the sort of racist stereotypes. So we have to think, when we put on use our historian's toolbox here, we have to think about the context, right, of depictions of African Americans at different historical time periods. This is the context of the failure of Reconstruction, and we see, right, the rise of white supremacy after, I mean, slavery is based on racism, but post-slavery, right, racism, it becomes even more coherent as an ideology, because in theory, that, or in legal, you know, Black people are equal under the law. So you have, again, this is when you get the rise of the birth of the KKK. And of course, African Americans are challenging these tropes. We have the first, the sort of talented 10th, and Du Bois and Charles Woodson, and at the turn of the century, you get the first sort of serious study of Black history. So we can't forget that despite these sort of racist ideologies and racist imagery and stereotypes, that African Americans are challenging white supremacy in all sorts of ways in every turn. And then when you think about the comparison between these two images, you have to think about, of course, who the authors are and who the authors' intended audiences were. And then I guess finally the analysis is how Black people are depicted, right? Who the authors are. That's why it's important for us to consider Black institutions, Black artists, Black documentary makers, right? In comparison, especially to depictions of Black people by non-Black people. So we have to sort of think about that in a way to sort of dismantle sort of racial tropes and stereotypes. So that was a theme for me that came up in the documentary that plays into the mythology of Black criminality. All right, so how Black people are depicted and where and by whom. Okay, so that is those were my sort of three themes that I was trying to sort of weave together with mass incarceration, racist policies, sort of corporate interest and politicians, the first private prison system, the corporate corrections of America, and then these sort of this racist imagery that is meant to incite fear, right? Again, it's sort of incite sort of fear. So that's what I have. I do have a parting slide, but before I get to that parting slide, again, I want to thank everybody and let anybody who has a question or a comment to feel free.
I just want to quickly say that this conversation that we're having today is amazing, and I'm so glad that we did this tonight, because this is part of what helps make what I was talking about less of an issue. The more that we talk about this, the more we have these conversations, the more we explore uncomfortable territory for some people, the better it can get for us. And so I just really thank the organizers for putting this together for us. It's been a great evening.
Thank you, Xavier. I concur. Anybody else?
Yes, I just want to say thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I'd like to say thank you too. And I think something I've been thinking about a little is how quickly people let go of ideals. Like I've been reading a little bit about Richard Nixon and his presidency, and it amazes me how fast people went from supporting the civil rights movement in like 1964 to being against it in like 1966.
Right.
So I think it's like being involved in a real conversation with real people like this is probably helps to counter that kind of like thinking something's a good idea but not really knowing anyone or anything like real practical about it. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Allie. Thanks, Christina. And the parting slide here, of course, is the first note here is if you're interested in registering for a late start African American history class with me, that is still available. I think there's about 10 slots open, and even if it overflows, I accept people. It's really good. And then the remainder of the programming here, there's a time documentary question Q&A here, February 18th from 5 to 6 p.m. And there's a Black Academic Excellence Excellence Center at the Cal Poly Mixer. That's February 22nd from 4 to 5 p.m. And then the Black Talent Gathering on February 26th from 6 to 7:30, hosted by, of course, Christina and Dawn and that. So I think that Allie will be able to circulate this PowerPoint, and then also these flyers should have been circulated, I think, already through the college. So.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor McKiernan. If you enjoyed this conversation, I know I did. The Time documentary is really going to provide you the example of what happens to a family because of the 13th Amendment. And then we have one of our CNC students, Gregory Williams, will be speaking and sharing his story. And so I listened to it. I listened to it briefly, but I was amazed, and I'm excited for us to delve into that more. But you know, I really appreciate this conversation because you know, I watch some of these documentaries and then I have nobody to talk about them with most of the time. And so a lot of those emotions, thoughts, feelings, they kind of get, you know, they just get hard, like they just stay there. They stay as thoughts and emotions and feelings, and I have no way to really discuss them. So this was really great to really delve further into the 13th Amendment movie. And I know I was one of those people that just kind of kept a lot of this stuff at arm's length. It's easier to ignore it or to feel like, oh, well, that's not me, that's not impacting me. But in reality, it is, you know, in the way I think about my siblings when they go out into the streets, you know, are something going to happen to them? It's very real. That fear is very real. And so thank you for providing some more context for us.
Yep, thank you, Zach. You were always so willing to guide us.
It's an honor, and it was my pleasure. So I bid everybody a good night, and I'm going to go ahead and sign off here. Okay.
All right.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Okay. Take care, y'all. All right. Stay safe.